Can you describe the types of dough you know and their uses? I've worked with many kinds of dough. For example, bread dough for making bread and buns, pastry dough like puff pastry for croissants, pizza dough specifically for pizzas, and sweet dough for cakes and donuts. Each type is mixed and treated differently depending on what we're baking. Can you describe how you make sure your baking is consistent? I follow recipes very carefully and use measuring tools for all ingredients. I also make sure the oven is at the right temperature and check the baking time. This helps me bake products that look and taste the same every time. What do you do to keep your bakery clean and safe? I always wash my hands and wear clean uniforms. The baking area and tools are cleaned regularly. Ingredients are stored properly, and we make sure everything stays fresh. I also separate ingredients to avoid mixing allergens. What would you do if a batch didn't turn out well? I would check what went wrong. Maybe the ingredients were measured wrong or the oven temperature was off. Once I know the problem, I fix it and start again. I also make notes to avoid the same mistake next time. How do you make sourdough bread? Sourdough bread is made with a starter instead of yeast. You mix flour and water, let it ferment, and then use it in the dough. It takes longer to rise, but the bread has a nice tangy flavor and a chewy texture. How do you make new baking ideas? I like to try new recipes, combine flavors, or use seasonal ingredients. For example, adding mango to a cake during summer. I always test new ideas first to make sure they taste good before selling them. How do you bake for a lot of people? I plan ahead and bake in batches. I organize my work so everything is ready on time. I also make sure to have enough ingredients and use the equipment efficiently, like filling the oven fully for every bake. How do you handle special diets like gluten-free or vegan? I use special ingredients for those needs, like almond flour for gluten-free bread or plant-based butter for vegan cakes. I also keep these products separate from others to avoid any mixing. What do you check when making a new product? I check if people would like it, how much it costs to make, and if I can bake it with the tools I have. I also test how long it stays fresh and how it tastes before selling it. How do you keep learning new baking skills? I watch videos, read baking books, and talk to other bakers to learn new ideas. I also practice new recipes in my free time to get better at them. Why is temperature important in baking? Temperature affects how dough rises, how cakes bake, and how crusts turn golden brown. I always use thermometers to check oven heat and dough temperature to make sure everything bakes properly. Have you ever improved a baking process? Yes. Once I started mixing dough in smaller batches to save time and avoid overmixing. This made the bread softer and fresher, and customers loved it. What ingredients are essential for baking bread? The main ingredients are flour, water, yeast, and salt. Sometimes I add sugar, butter, or milk, depending on the recipe. Each ingredient has a specific role, like yeast for rising and salt for flavor. What is proofing and why is it important? Proofing is when the dough rests and rises before baking. It lets the yeast create gas, making the bread light and fluffy. If you skip proofing, the bread will be dense and not rise properly. How do you make sure the bread is baked perfectly? I check the color of the crust and tap the bread. It should sound hollow. For some products, I use a thermometer to check the internal temperature, which should be around 90 degrees C to 95 degrees C for fully baked bread.
What is the difference between cake flour and bread flour?
Cake flour has less protein, so it makes soft and fluffy cakes. Bread flour has more protein, which helps form gluten, making the bread chewy and strong. How do you ensure proper mixing of dough? I mix the dough until it's smooth and elastic. Overmixing can make the dough too tough, and undermixing can leave lumps. I also use the right speed and time for the mixer. What is blind baking? Blind baking is pre-baking a pie crust before adding the filling. This prevents the crust from getting soggy when you add wet ingredients like custard or fruit. How do you decorate cakes or pastries? I use tools like piping bags for icing and spatulas for spreading cream. I also use edible decorations like sprinkles, chocolate shavings, or fresh fruit to make them look attractive. What is the difference between baking powder and baking soda? Baking soda needs an acid like lemon juice to work, while baking powder already has acid in it. Both are used to make cakes and cookies rise, but they can't be swapped exactly. What causes bread to be too dense? Bread can be dense if the dough didn't rise enough, if the yeast was old, or if too much flour was added. I always check these factors to get good results. What tools do you use for baking? I use tools like mixers, rolling pins, thermometers, weighing scales, and baking trays. Each tool helps me work faster and more accurately. How do you prevent a cake from sticking to the pan? I grease the pan with butter or oil and sprinkle flour or use baking paper. This ensures the cake comes out easily after baking. How do you handle customer feedback about your products? I listen carefully to what they say and make improvements based on their feedback. For example, if someone wants less sugar, I adjust the recipe next time. What is laminating in baking? Laminating is folding layers of butter into dough to create layers, like in croissants or puff pastry. It makes the pastry flaky and light. What is the purpose of sifting flour? Sifting removes lumps and adds air to the flour, making it easier to mix. It helps make cakes and pastries light and smooth. How do you handle stress in a busy kitchen? I stay organized and focus on one task at a time. I also communicate with the team to make sure everything runs smoothly. What are some common baking problems, and how do you fix them? Flat cookies. Chill the dough before baking. Dry cakes. Reduce baking time or check the oven temperature. Hard bread crust. Cover the bread while baking to keep it soft. What is the difference between a sponge cake and a butter cake? A sponge cake is light and airy, made by whipping eggs and sugar. A butter cake is denser, made with butter, sugar, and flour. How do you control costs in baking? I measure ingredients carefully to avoid waste, plan the menu based on demand, and buy supplies in bulk when possible.
What is your favorite thing to bake and why?
I enjoy baking bread because it's simple but so satisfying. The smell of fresh bread and the soft texture make it worth the effort every time.